Well, welcome back to See, Hear, Love, our special podcast episode. And I have a very incredible woman I'm really excited to listen to and learn from, Kat Armas. She's a Cuban-American writer and podcaster from Miami, Florida. She was awarded the Frederick Buechner Award for Excellence in Writing. And she is the author of Abuelita Faith, What Women on the Margins Teach Us About Wisdom, Persistence, and Strength. And this sits at the intersection of women, decolonialize. Oh my gosh, I can't say it. I was practicing this, Kat, because I was going to say decolonization, but it's decolonialism, the Bible, and Cuban identity. Oh my gosh.
I mean, decolonization, decolonialism,
Yeah, I was like... I was like, what is happening here? She also explores these topics and more on her podcast, The Protagonistas, which that's awesome, which centers the voices of Black, Indigenous, and other women of color in theological spaces. Kat is currently living in Nashville with her spouse, new baby, and you're working on your second book, which is really, really exciting. So, Kat, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
Yes, and I'm so excited, especially to talk about the book. But before we get started on your book, was reading through your bio, and see that you grew up on the outskirts of Little Havana, which my girlfriend and I just went to South Beach in Miami for a little girls' trip. And we went to Little Havana, which is incredible, and we hung out at the Ball and Chain.
Mm-hmm. I've been there.
And I did a little dancing. There's so much history in that place. We enjoyed the food. What an incredible area, Little Havana. What was it like growing up outside of it? What was it like living in the area?
Yeah, I mean, it was great. It was what I knew nothing else besides that, right? And for me growing up, because Cuban culture is such a, integral part of Miami culture, of Miami in general. I mean, I grew up like that, very Cuban, like Domino's. Like, I don't know if you passed by the Domino Park and... but Domino's, yes. I have a whole chapter on my book about it because that was what we did every weekend, Fridays and Saturdays till 3:00 in the morning. And I obviously, I was a child, but I mean, the adults, stayed up later than we did playing Domino's every weekend,
Mm-hmm.
And that was, all I knew growing up. And so the music and the food and it's a very vibrant, intense, in both good and bad ways, right? Intense culture. There's so much love and so much community and so much culture, so much rich culture. But then you have your deep machismo, patriarchal, hierarchical sort of views. So, you have, just like every culture, you have your things. But it was so much fun. And it was something that I didn't realize just how different or how vibrant my culture was until I left Miami. And I realized, it's not like this everywhere else, right? It's not like this. And so that's really where a lot of my story stems from. It stems from growing up in Miami, out in the outskirts of Little Havana, and, then leaving and realizing, oh, wait a minute, my culture is very unique. And I was so blessed to have had that experience.
Mm-hmm. Have you been back to Cuba, or have you visited Cuba?
So that's very complicated. My family, when they left, my grandmother's still alive. And so obviously, my book is about her. And I do have I talk about it in one of my chapters of how I was planning a mission trip to Cuba, actually. And the night that I was supposed to leave, my he sort of was like my grandfather, but my grandmother's husband passed away, and it was somewhat unexpectedly. I mean, we knew that he was sick, but we weren't expecting him to, pass that night. And I really sort of took that as maybe not really a sign, but sort of like oh, wait a minute, because my grandmother, she didn't know I was going, because, she was very against me going back, just because of how so much of her family was suffering and had suffered, those that stayed behind. And so she was, just very against me going back. So I didn't tell her. So she didn't know. She just thought I was going on a trip. And I mean, I don't remember exactly what she thought. And that, that night when my mother called me and told me, Mario, which is his name, Mario's dead. And so I went to the house and, she was whispering to me like, you should go in the morning. And then I was like, no, I think I need to be here, with Abuela. I need to be here with my grandmother. And yeah, so, that's such a weird and, interesting part of that my connection to the actual island.
Yeah. I love Cuba. In my 20s, I've been to Cuba 5 times. And it was more of, it started off like a mission trip. We were going and bringing medical supplies and Bibles, and I was helping out a church in Trinidad. So I've been to Havana, Veradero, Santiago, Trinidad. And so, 5 times I've gone. We taught, we led worship. But it's something really special for me. I love the people, the food, the community. To be in that church community, Kat, was so beautiful, and I have such great memories. It was all in my 20s, and I just learned a lot. I think about seeing people who are dealing with great hardship and great loss. I think for the first time in my 20s, realizing what resilience was, and commitment and perseverance and love of family. Like, really saw that within every town and community that I was a part of. And the church was really big on that. And I also, as a woman, it was great. I mean, I grew up in a Baptist church where women weren't supposed to speak or teach. And when I went to the church in Cuba, they were like, come on, girl. You're preaching today. You're speaking. Yeah. You're going to get up and read scripture. And I was like, what? Oh, my gosh. Yes. Awesome. I had to leave Canada to go to Cuba to release my gifting and passions and call. But it was beautiful memories. And I really have. And, bringing Bibles into Cuba when you couldn't, we would gift our brothers and sisters with Bibles. But and just, I think too, as a young woman, just the importance of the scripture at that time in my life, seeing that. So I have very strong, I have great love. I have great love for the people of Cuba, but I also understood what your grandmother and what you're saying about your grandmother and the experiences, understood that too, but just loved the people. And the food.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. We still have a lot of connections to family that have recently come within the last, 5-10 years. And so we feel very much connected, specifically because the culture in Miami also is, so Cuban, and it is very different, I always say that, when we talk about the island and when we talk about Cuba, it's always so complicated because of the political strife, particularly the connections with the U.S. and Cuba.
Yes.
And sort of like where I land is that empire, empire creates vulnerabilities in other countries and then convinces them that only they can save them from those vulnerabilities that they created, right? And so that's sort of how I feel about the U.S. and Cuba. And so, there's a lot of tension. There's a lot of, because there's so much political propaganda that's sort of wrapped up in, the U.S.-Cuba relations, obviously on the U.S.'s end. And really because there's a lot of racism, when a lot of the Cubans that came in the 50s and 60s, a lot of them were white. And so the way that Cubans were treated compared to Haitians, compared to many Dominicans, was very different. And so it's just very complicated. But then there's also, as you mentioned, that other side where so many folks who did migrate over here, they did undergo a lot of trauma. They did undergo a lot of hardship. A lot of people lost their land, their businesses, their homes. So there is that sort of, holding this tension of, naming naming where there are power, naming where there are privileges, naming where there's political propaganda, but then also at the same time, naming that there's trauma and that there's hardship. And, none of that is easy to tease out, and none of that is simple. And so I think so much of that, and particularly me, as, born in this country, but very, very much connected to the Cuban culture, very much connected to Cuban people here and, on the island, I sort of sit in that tension a lot, and that's a lot of what my book is about, sitting in this tension of what it means to be human. Me, particularly as a Cuban-American, me as a, progressive, politically progressive Cuban-American living, very much connected to a city of very politically progressive Cuban Americans because of what they went through. So sitting in that tension but then also at the same time, just what it means to be human and sit in the tension of being a person in the world, of me being a second generation, Cuban-American, and being, feeling how we say ni de aquí ni de allá, which is neither from here nor from there. But I sort of try and wrestle with that and put it on its head. Like, what if I'm from here and from there? What if, we don't have to be from one specific place, but we can, we can be people, border people, right? So that's a lot of what I wrestle with and what I struggle with, just as, politically and just as, someone culturally and ethnically, but also just spiritually. And
I so appreciate that. I think, Kat, a lot of people I know are sitting in that tension. There's a lot, we have a lot of second generation people here in Canada, wrestling with that. And I would say a bit for me, I was adopted. I'm a Filipino adopted by a Canadian family, grew up in Asia, came to Canada, and my family struggled with that too. My parents are white. My brother and sister, their birth kids are white. They struggled because they were very much Asian but looked Canadian. I'm looking Filipino but brought up Canadian culturally. There's so much. And then throw in church culture and throw in all of that, and we're sitting in a lot of tension that, like you said, that we hold. And so I appreciate that honesty about that, because I think that is where, I think for a lot of people, trying to understand and talk about and sit in it and hold it and then make hard decisions in regards to next steps forward, or
or just how to be
how we
in the
live
world.
this out. And how to be in this world. That's exactly how to be in this world. It's so difficult. It's interesting we're talking because, I was just saying, I was with some friends last night, and my husband and I were away up at a cottage up in Muskoka. And those are the questions we're all facing. We're all in our 40s, and we're like, how to be in this world? How do you be your true authentic self, knowing that people are going to, not extremely cancel you, but judge you, shame you, do all that. But be your authentic self and be okay and strong in it. It's hard, exhausting, and I know it is. It really, really is.
And talking about, sort of being in that tension, I think sort of a lot of what I wrestle with in my writing is, and we talked about decolonization or decolonialism, but it's this notion that, in Western ideology and in Western thought, it's uncomfortable with this it's uncomfortable with this gray, this middle, this uncertain. We're brought up believing that everything needs to be clear and everything needs to be black and white. And, and so I think that that's also part of the tension, is that, and that's why I say, it's not that I'm ni de aquí, ni de allá. It's not that I'm not from here nor from there, that I am from both here and there. And that's where I want, although it makes the dominant culture uncomfortable, that's where I want to exist fully and be, as a complicated person, like you mentioned, it's hard to be in the world, to be authentic and to be, this and to be that. And we're trying to be authentic, but that comes with so many complicated things, I'm a new mom. And so even in that, just trying to navigate relationships in a new way and trying to navigate, my past and my childhood and all the things that brings up. And and so I think, being patient with ourselves and giving ourselves some grace, and that we are human and we're complicated people. And, even in our authenticity, we're still very complicated, right? So that's just something that I think I wrestle with a lot. And even talking about an Abuelita Faith, I talk a lot about survival and how survival is in and of itself holy and sacred. And, my grandmother, she's a woman of survival, right? But at the same time, survival forces people to do questionable things because you're just trying to eat, to live, to exist in the world, right? And so survival is not neat or pretty or decent even, and that's what I talk a lot about in Abuelita Faith. So many women in the Bible do quote unquote indecent things because they're trying to survive, but they're called holy and blessed for it, right? You have, women pretending to be, other people's in order so they can sleep with their father-in-law so they can secure their own future. Like, it's not, it's complicated. It's complicated. And so I think that life is that complicated, that tension, that is life. And, you know, we've sort of been shamed to feel or believe that, you know, we can't be complicated people, or, you know, but yeah, I don't
So
agree with
good, Kat. Honestly, it's all like yes, yes, and yes. I think, thank God for, well, first of all, why I wanted to chat with you is because what you're just saying about those often dismissed because of, and think about what women, you said the things that they've done, and you've added like race, gender, socioeconomic status, lack of education. That's me. I mean, people say, you know, how did you get where you are, Melinda? They think I have all of this background in broadcasting, zero. How to learn on my own. All the things that I struggled with, my prodigal years, the poor choices I made, the deep regrets I have, and yet here I am. And, you know, I say grace of God, perseverance, good community, somehow a deep sense of God, even though I ignored him for many years. I'm here I am.
Yeah.
And I have not been discounted or, you know, in my life. And I think that's part of the story. I love that, because I feel like more women and men need to be reminded of this, of your Abuelita Faith, the theology of, because we, not only do others discount you, you yourself are the biggest person who discounts yourself, you know, discounts you.
Yeah.
Like, I was the one who was eliminating me from the race and eliminating me from jobs and eliminating me from opportunities. I was the biggest roadblock to success or freedom, you know, all of that, right? And so what an incredible message you have in this book and what you're saying, that I really want to talk about, because I think this truth needs to be like screamed from the rooftops to remind people, right?
Yeah.
Because so much more of the world is like so easy to shame and point a finger at what you're not doing, and how you're a horrible mother, and how you're not a great friend, and you're not a great wife, and you're not a great this, and this.
Yeah.
And we can't hear that any longer. And I want, you know, people to hear this. So let's talk about this. Let's unpack this a bit more. You start off with, you know, what if some of our greatest theologians wouldn't be considered theologians at all, which I just love that. And then you talk about, you know, the voices on the margins have more to teach us about following God than we realize.
Yeah.
So let's talk about that. And then in that, you know, maybe interweave a bit of more of your story about your grandmother, your Abuelita, because I'm dying to hear about her journey too.
Yeah. Thanks for asking. So I sort of look at this idea of knowledge, right? When it comes to theology, when it comes to knowing God, when it comes to being a human in the world, right? And so I kind of tackle it from the idea of knowledge. And I ask, like, what is knowledge, right? And who gets to say, right? Who is wise? And who gets to say who is wise? Because we have this idea of what wisdom is, who the wise one is, because we've been told that wisdom comes from, you know, as you mentioned, you grew up Baptist, right? So we have this image of what the wise person, you know, looks like, or we have this image of who we're supposed to learn from, particularly when it comes to the things of God. You know, I know for me, you know, I grew up in an immigrant Roman Catholic community. You know, Miami's very Catholic, because a lot of folks who came from Cuba were very Catholic, you know, and obviously that comes from the colonizer. You know, the colonizers were Catholic and all that, but there was this popular Catholicism that my grandmother, you know, sort of held on to, and just many in my community, not just my grandmother, but it's this sort of mix of Catholicism, but the kind that you practice at home because you don't have the resources to make it to mass, you know, whether you don't live too far, or, you know, so you kind of practice it at home, and you build altars, and you know, have this connection to the saints. And so that's sort of how I was raised. And so my grandmother, she was sort of the beacon of spirituality and faith in my life and in my community. And she didn't have a theology degree. She didn't even have a high school, you know, degree. She didn't go to high school. You know, she didn't lead a small group. She didn't preach. She didn't do any of those things because she was not allowed to, right? But she didn't do any of those things. But, you know, I sort of wrestle with, well, what is it about her life that makes her a theologian, right? And it's not because she led small groups, or because she, you know, taught, you know, the Bible from a pulpit. But what was it about her life that tells me that she was the greatest theologian that I've ever known, right? And that's where I start sort of wrestling with the idea of what an abuelita theology is. My grandmother, she made clothes for a living, and that's how she provided for our family, and that's how she provided for those in our community, right? She had a table, and it was her. I like to say that, we always say, let's invite folks to our table. But no, my grandmother had her own table, and we were her guests, and we sat at her table, and she made us food, and she fed her community, the people in her community. My grandmother, she loved to dance, and that's how she, expressed so much of her love and so much of her, in this embodied sort of way of being, how she communicated so much truth and so much joy in her life. There were so many things about my grandmother's life. And when I look at the women in the Bible, I see so many similarities of women in scripture who lived out their calling, who theologized, who were faithful to God, not because they preached on pulpits or not because they had seminary degrees, which I have, right? I'm not saying anything against seminary degrees, but because they used their bodies and because they used the resources that they had and their devotion and their love for God to theologize. And I think that's where, when we read scripture, we see that they are called righteous, they are called faithful, they are included in the genealogy of Jesus. I mean, you look at the Canaanite woman, right? Triply, quadruply marginalized. She's like begging Jesus, to help her daughter. And she's just, she's, she's found in a space where she's not, it's not her domain, right? So all these categories make her marginalized. But yet she's the one who proclaims that Jesus is the Son of God, and others of his, before all of his disciples do, right? So it's this that I'm talking about. It's this sort of like folks who are not brought down by systems of privilege and power, who aren't, clouded by privilege and power, but they are surviving in the midst, of being brought down by systems of privilege and power. I feel like they can see something, something that many, including myself, right? I have varying levels of privilege. I'm educated and, all of these things. I was born in this country, in the US, and I am documented, right? I have privileges that a lot of folks that I know that raised me don't or didn't. And there was a connection to the divine, to God, that I feel like many of us miss out on because their survival is rooted in their faith, and their faith is rooted in survival, right? So I like to say that an abuelita theology is a theology rooted in survival, and that survival is holy in and of itself. We don't need to spiritualize survival to make it holy. It is holy. And you see that in the lives of so many women. You see that in the lives of women in the Bible, women in our society. My abuelita, right, are the grandmothers and the mothers and the marginalized women in our midst. So yeah, that's a little bit of what I talk about.
Yeah, Kat, I've never heard that, to theologize by using bodies and resources. I've never heard that. I'm sitting on that. I'm like, wow, because culturally, and within church, like, theology is like, well, we study, right?
The mind. Yeah.
Then the ones who have degrees and the experience, the authority would then, share their thoughts. That's what we would learn from. We'd receive what we take, and that's how we would live. That's how it's always been.
Yeah.
But this, I'm kind of sitting here like, thinking about it, start processing, but that just shifted me. I'd never heard that before, and that makes way more sense,
right?
I mean, to me, yeah.
If theology is the study of God, and so we can study God, in our everyday lived experiences. We're thinking about God, we're processing about God, we're but yeah, as you said, and that's why I start, I sort of, the introduction of my book is to ask this question, well, like, what is wisdom, and who is wise, and who gets to say? And,
I like that.
I feel like that's sort of the crux of this. Who gets to say? And it's the folks who have gotten to say who is wise and what wisdom is. Those are the ones that we've been listening to. But we're missing so much. We're missing so much about survival, about lived experience.
Yeah.
So much. And that's
Yes.
what I argue is where we learn the most about God. You know, it's in lived experience. It's in survival. That's where God shows up again and again and again in scripture. Folks just trying to live. I mean, you look at the story of Ruth and Naomi. They're just, you know, we love to spiritualize that story. And of course, I mean, I think, you know, it's fine to spiritualize. Mm-hmm. But they were also just trying to survive. Like, they just, you know, like, their husbands died. They needed to find a way to, you know, be provided for the rest of their lives. And so they were just trying to survive. But that survival is holy. I mean, they're considered, right? They're righteous and blessed by God in the genealogy of like all these things. And they were just simply trying to survive. But that's where we learn so much about faith and life and the tension that we're talking about. And, you know, so.
So you've named them. I was going to actually kind of ask you to kind of go through, tease us a bit about some of these women who you say are unnamed and overlooked theologians in the Bible. Now, when you say unnamed name, but you mentioned Ruth and Naomi. What other women in the Bible, because I'm fascinated, would you say are unnamed and overlooked theologians?
Yeah, so one of my favorites, and because I feel like it mirrors my grandmother's story so well, is Tabitha in Acts. And Tabitha, also called Dorcas. And I love her story because it's short. And I feel like so many of the stories of the women in the Bible are like short, a couple sentences, a paragraph, right? You know, well, the Bible is written by men for men. So, you know, women are kind of like side stories. But if you tease them out, you know, you realize, wait a minute, you know, no, this is... So I love her story because it's short. It's a quick paragraph. You know, she dies. They call Peter to come resurrect her. You know, when he comes to resurrect her, all the women and all the widows in the community are standing by her bedside saying, look at the tunics she made us. And I'm like, well, wait a minute. Hold on a second. And she's called a disciple. And so this is what really stood out to me, that she's the only woman in the New Testament specifically called a disciple. In other places, we have women and men together called disciples, but she's specifically called a disciple. So I mulled over that for a while. Why is she called a disciple? What do we know about this woman that she's a disciple? And all we know about her is that she made clothes. And she not only made clothes, but she made clothes for the widows in the community who, a few chapters before this in Acts, there was that whole debacle between the Greek-speaking Jews and the, you know, they were all arguing because the widows were being ignored. And so they had to appoint people to take care of the widows, because the widows are the group of people that God is continuously saying, you know, protect the widows, take care of the widows, you know, look after widows, because they are the most vulnerable. And here we have Tabitha dedicating her life to widows by using her hands, literally, and her, you know, her body, using her hands and her body to sew and make clothes for the widows in the community. She's doing the thing that God says to do, right? Like, it's simple. Take care of the widows. And that's what Tabitha is doing. And I absolutely love that because it mirrors my grandmother's story. And that's what my grandmother did. She used her hands to serve, to create, to co-create, to love, to provide, right? To provide for her family. I mean, she used her hands to do that through sewing. And I see that in Tabitha's story. And I absolutely love that. And I argue that's what makes her a disciple. We don't need to know anything else other than she did the thing that she was called to do, right? And that's what made her a disciple. So she's one of my favorites. And then another quick one is Rizpah in 1 Samuel. Again, her story's 2 sentences. And no one had ever, I mean, I was in seminary. I've been to seminary. You know, I was many years in seminary. And I had never heard of her story until...
Yeah, this is interesting. Yeah, I would like to hear this. I don't think I've heard of her.
Yeah, I mean, not a lot of people talk about her, again, because her story is short. And it's sort of in passing, you know, there's an issue with David and the Gibeonites. And, you know, so they find out that Saul had murdered some folks that he wasn't supposed to murder. And so they needed to avenge that murder. So then David's like, okay, yeah, just murder his sons, which happened to be Rizpah's. He was a concubine of Saul, which happened to be Rizpah's sons. Yeah. So he murders Rizpah's sons. And it's kind of like, yeah, whatever. Yeah, just kill them, you know. But Rizpah, she, because of this this injustice that happens, Rizpah stays by their grave for 6 months because they weren't buried properly. And if you know Jewish, you know, customs, proper burial was extremely important, right? So she stays by their grave, almost, you know, creating this sort of altar, this sacred space, because they weren't buried properly. So she's essentially protesting their murder, protesting the injustice that had happened to her sons for 6 months. She's literally, again, putting her body on the line for the sake of justice. And it's because of this that David takes notice of what's happening. And sorry, I forgot a very important part. There had been a famine for 3 years in Israel. So this is also, there had been a famine. And that's why David, wondered, why is there a famine, God? And that's when he told them about the whole debacle between the Gibeonites and all that, and all this needs to be avenged. Anyway, so when David, it wasn't until he noticed that Rizpah was protesting for those 6 months that he decided to right the wrongs that had happened. He ended up burying, doing proper burial, just realizing all that was, happening. And that, when he righted those wrongs, that's when God sent rain. And it was because of Rizpah's protest. And so, these are completely overlooked stories. But, it's literally Rizpah's bodily protest ended a 3-year famine in Israel. And it was because she was like, this is not right. And I will stand here and I will put my body on the line until someone notices that this is not right. And it wasn't until David the king noticed, said, hey, what's going on here?
Incredible.
Right. And mind you, he inquired of God, why is there a famine? And God said, oh, well, because of this. And he tried, he thought that he was doing the right thing by, killing off more people. But no, there needed to be justice in order for God to send rain. And so those are 2 of my favorite stories. And there's plenty more in my book.
Yeah, Kat, that's an amazing story. I need to look back at that because I think we tend to, and again, this is another side tangent, but when we read the Bible, you kind of just sort of read through the story to get to the end of the story.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
Like, read it, done it, on we go to the next chapter.
Right.
And I think it's important to be reminded to kind of sit within the story, reread it again, sit in it, and see what's being said. I remember that, but I don't remember that part, and I think I need to go back to that. That's amazing. And I think that's, I think that is encouraging for a lot of people who many people I know of, even myself, who've disqualified themselves from any work of, and I'm not going to say ministry or what I'm doing, like as a Christian broadcaster or a writer, but, people disqualify themselves because they don't know. Right. They're, like you've said, they're not educated. They don't have the degree. Maybe they just can't comprehend as quickly, or it takes them a bit longer to understand, But in these stories and what you're saying, it's like our bodies, the one thing we can do, the sowing, the protest, the being present, God can use that. And I think that we need to be reminded of that. Even for myself, sometimes I get so uptight about making sure I know everything, before I go on air. Yeah. Make sure I'm well-versed and I've got it together. And I think that showing up.
Exactly, yeah. Just the showing up.
The showing up, right? The showing up is what you can do. Yeah.
Yeah. That makes me think of Miriam. I talked about dance earlier and my grandmother, but that reminds me of Miriam in the Bible. And, right after she leads Israel out of the Exodus, and they cross over the Red Sea after, Pharaoh's army comes to try and destroy them, and they end up getting destroyed in the Red Sea and all that. She literally takes out a timbrel, and I like to say that she pulls out of her back pocket. We don't know where this timbrel comes from, but she pulls out a timbrel. Mind you, they're wandering. Like, they just had to take essentials and go. But a timbrel for her somehow was essential. And I love how some commentators say that this is her, again, wisdom, the wisdom of women, right? She pulls out a timbrel and she leads the congregation, but she leads Israel in song and dance, right? And it's that moment of just, she just shows up. She just shows up, and just, this is a time to sing and dance. We don't know what's happening. We don't know where we're going. We don't know we don't know anything, but we're going to stand right here. We're going to sing and we're going to dance. And she just leads everyone in dance, And that's why I say, again, the body, right? It's that moment. Yeah. There's no degree involved. She didn't preach a sermon, but she probably did something that was way more, whatever the word is. I can't think of it, but there was way more powerful, I guess you can say.
Yeah.
Was leading.
I wish somebody had people into dance and sung.
Sorry, say that again.
I wish somebody had told me that when I was younger, because I loved to dance and sing. Yeah. But it was always in my church culture back then. That wasn't right?
Right.
It could lead to something worse, whatever. But there is that, and I knew that. I knew that as a young girl, that dancing and singing and expressing wasn't bad, but somehow in Christian culture, it became bad. It became something that was associated with, sexual, over sexualization or sexuality.
Right.
But I knew deep down, because I'd seen it, in the Philippines, and I'd seen other Asian cultures where dance was the expression of joy and happiness and community and bringing people together and singing. And so, it's good to be reminded of Miriam as well. I think that, again, the showing up, the body, the bringing of together, or in that, using your gifts to help and serve the widows. Like, it makes so much sense, Kat.
Yeah.
It's almost like a simple thing, but we've lost it, and we've added on the other parts to it to make it more complicated, and also make it so that other people cannot be a part of theology or
it's power
of that. Power. Exactly.
Yeah. It's
wow.
Yeah, it's a maintaining of power. You don't want to give that up. Those in power don't want to give up their power. And as you were speaking, I also thought of, it's the showing up, but it's showing up in your full self, right? Like you can't lead a community in dance if you're not showing up in the fullness of who you are. You can't provide for an entire community of widows if you're not showing up with your full self. I think of Abuela. I think of my grandmother. I think of how in everything, in her cooking, in her dancing, in her sewing, she showed up fully, and it was complicated, right? She had some things, right? Like, just like all of us do. She wasn't perfect, but she was authentic, and she was her full self, and she just did the thing, and she wasn't worried about whatever, she was, again, just trying to survive, but I think it's that showing up in the fullness of who we are. We're fully present, we're fully dancing, we're fully using our gifts of our hands to sew, and we're
this is so good. It's so good. I know that you mentioned, because I know that we talked about sort of the overlooked theologians in the Bible, but you also have overlooked theologians in society. Now, I know that's one, like your grandma, but is there somebody that we've missed in sort of almost like mainstream society that is somebody that's made the difference, but we just don't know?
Yeah, so, one example that I love to give, and this is sort of a perfect example of what I believe in Abuelita theology sort of is, so we look to those who we are told are wise, or those who are, the charismatic folks, the folks in the front and center. We look to like the MLKs, right, who are leading entire civil rights movements. And of course, 100% we should. I'm not saying, but I one example that I give in my book is that, the civil rights movement wouldn't have been what it was without the Montgomery bus boycott. That's sort of what launched the civil rights movement, in a big way. And that was started by Joanne Robinson and a group of women who began sending out. They're the ones who who sort of started this whole boycott going, right? They passed out flyers, and they were, and it literally was that event, and it was their faithfulness of just getting this thing going. And of course, I'm sure they wouldn't have ever known, what that would have become. And of course, the time was right in history. I mean, everything was ripe for that. But I just love that, this is what I call, Joanne Robinson, an Abuelita theologian, just being faithful, just doing the thing. And it launches this cataclysmic event in history, right? And of course, we know it. I mean, and again, MLK, he's the face of the civil rights movement, but it wouldn't have been what it was if it wasn't for women like Joanne Robinson and her faithful, however many women that I don't even know their names, that were faithful in doing what it was that they, bringing their full selves to the cause. So that's one example that I love. And another one, I was actually just, I host I'm helping a friend host another podcast, and he interviewed this woman, Lydia Lopez, and she is one of the leaders over on the West Coast in California of, the workers' rights union and all of that, with Cesar Chavez and the farm workers movement. And, as she's sharing her story, she's sharing about how she found herself in all of these very, important protests and very important places, and she got arrested while she was pregnant, and it was all just because she was literally just showing up. Like, it wasn't, she was she was just showing up, and she all these things. And my friend, he asks her, they're kind of having a conversation, and she says, but I wasn't a leader in the movement. That was Cesar and Cesar Chavez and those folks. Like, and he's like, what do you mean you weren't a leader in the movement? Like, you were getting arrested alongside of him, right? But she says, I was in the background when everyone else, there was like several arrests, but in one of them, she was able to escape, and a bunch of them, they got arrested for protesting at a Catholic church, actually, during Christmas Mass. They were protesting on behalf of the poor people, and she stayed behind. And when everybody, they had gone off to jail, for the night, and it was Christmas Eve, and all of their children were left, parentless on Christmas Eve. And so she got all the children together, and she, just spent Christmas morning with them, and just hearing that, and I'm like, and you say you're not a leader in the movement? I mean, you were the one spending Christmas with the children and that will forever be remembered. And because of that, they will grow up and probably do something similar, for the next generation, So if you think generationally, she was 100% was a leader, right? So yeah, I think of people like her. I think of, so many women, and I name a bunch other ones in my book, but so many women who played quote unquote background roles, in these huge movements, but they were not background at all because, I mean, you do a show, you wouldn't be able to do the show without all the background, quote unquote
and
people.
I have a lot of background people that support me. Yes.
Right.
100%.
And so, I feel like that is such a huge part of history and just, again, the Bible, everything.
Yeah. Kat, as we finish up here, and I don't want to because there's so much good conversation, for the women who they're still like, I'm either afraid or I don't think I can do it, or I just don't, again, like what we said, they have the experience, knowledge. What do you say to those women, literally on the margins, who are like, I don't think I can, or I don't think I'm the right person? Yeah. What would you say? What would you say to them?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's so hard for me to answer because, of course, every situation is so different. But the first thing I want to say is you already are, in a sense that, we already are doing the thing. I think about, again, when Rispa was sitting there for 6 months protesting, she didn't think that anything was quote unquote happening, right? And I think that, I'm working on my second book, and I just kind of wrote about this, of how, we are all spiritual midwives and spiritual doulas. And the thing about being a spiritual midwife and a spiritual doula is that most of the time, if you've been through birth, or if you know someone who's been through a birth, most of the time, a lot of it is waiting. You're just like waiting for hours and hours and hours, and you're just sitting there, and you're just like, nothing is quote unquote happening, but so much is happening, right? Like so much inside of the birthing person's body is happening. You just, we don't see it, or we don't, because we're not the ones particularly. So when I say that we're all spiritual midwives and we're all spiritual doulas, men, women, everybody, all of us, oftentimes we are, assisting someone, or someone is assisting us, or we are in the birthing process. We just don't feel like something is happening. And so if we are, continuously day in and day out faithful and just doing the thing and showing up and being our full true selves and working towards healing ourselves and society, and we're, just doing what seems like the everyday mundane, I think that, that is the process of birthing. And I feel like there's something happening. We might just not see it, but it will happen if we're consistent. We are there and we're showing support to someone. It might not be birthing in us, but we might be assisting it in someone next to us, or, someone in our community. And then maybe it might be us next time, or maybe it's something is happening within, like our community as a whole, or, but yeah, so that's just something that comes to mind. Just think about how we might be, assisting, or spiritual midwives or doulas, or yeah.
Mm-hmm. It's good. I really learned some new things, Kat, from you. I really, I think this Abuelita theology is really fantastic. I want to use that in reference to what you're saying, when I do some speaking, because I think it's amazing. I think it reminds us also, for me, just the stories that I want to go back to about women and kind of sit in them and think about what they did, how they changed history. I think that's really important. I think I need to sing and dance more.
Yes, amen.
I did that a little bit at the Ball and Chain.
Yes,
some of the women got me up, and I was doing a little dance, which was so fun because it was like a live band, and I was like going around, and bought my husband a T-shirt.
I love it.
Yeah, it was fantastic. What a great night out there in Little Havana. But I just think that's really I'm so glad and thankful that you have written, about this reminder of, this Abuelita faith, what your book is, what women on the margins teach us about wisdom, persistence, and strength. I mean, that it's so empowering. It's so encouraging for so many who feel on the margins or don't feel seen, heard, and loved, which is really, essentially, our show. And so thank you. And I'm excited to read your next book coming up. It's The Sacred Belonging, a 40-day devotional on the liberating heart of Scripture. Mm-hmm. That's exciting.
Yeah, thank you.
Congratulations on that as you're working on that.
Thank you so much. Yeah, we just turned in a round of edits last night, so feeling good about that. But yeah, we wanted to reclaim the devotional space and, just kind of offer devotionals that are deep and, just different, hopefully.
Well, I'd like to pick that up because I will be honest, no offense to all the people I've interviewed that have done devotionals. But, oops, maybe I shouldn't have said that. But I am looking for a good devotional. I have found that it is. There's some I'm just like, it's just not doing it. And I'm really looking forward to this. I think something deep and thoughtful I can sit in that's interesting would be great. So I'm going to definitely, when you have that ready, let me know, because I need a new devotional, Kat.
Yes, great. Awesome. That makes me excited. Yeah, I start my devotional by saying, I'll be honest, I haven't read a devotional in years. That's like my first line. So
and it's like me, and I get so many sent to us, right? From so many different authors around the world. Again, I'm outing myself. Now everybody's going to be like, we're never coming on See Hear Love. She's completely dissing us and all the books we sent to her. Every publicist now, Kat, is like, yeah, no.
Oh,
I might have to edit that out with my producer.
No, I hear you. Like, I hear you.
I have them all, and I'm like, yeah, I'll get to them. And then I kind of like open. I'm like, because some of it, it's like, I've heard this before.
Right,
so anyway, no pressure, but yours better be really fantastic.
Oh, no. Okay. I'm trying.
Okay. Amazing. And I'm so thankful for your grandmother. I'm so grateful for the legacy that she's left. I'm so grateful for the history of your family. And I'm so grateful for, I think, just the courage and thoughtfulness of bringing these words to life in your new book. So thank you and congratulations and all the best with your new baby.
Oh, thank you so very much. Yeah.
That's exciting, and I know lots of late nights.
Yes, and very exhausting.
So, yeah. And to you, our viewers and listeners, we thank you for joining us on this really special podcast interview with Kat Armas. I hope you pick up her book again, Abuelita Faith, what women on the margins teach us about wisdom, persistence, and strength, and that you make sure you pick up her second book coming, Sacred Belonging, a 40-day devotional on the liberating heart of Scripture. And if you are feeling like you're on the margins and that you have nothing to offer, I hope our conversation inspired you and encouraged you that you have so much by bringing your body, your gifts, your voice, your protest, your sewing, your making food, your singing and dancing to the world. And see then what God can do through showing up, being present, because like Kat said, you already are. You already are, as you live and breathe and are in this world. So thank you so much for joining us, and know always that you are seen, heard, and deeply, deeply loved by God.